and Pastor for the prayer. It's wonderful, isn't it? You know, we didn't consult, and the Lord just weaves things together, and it's always confirmation that He is real and He's with us, and that's just so encouraging. I just wanted to start off with a couple of quotes that are intentionally juxtaposed, and ask you to keep these things in mind as we go forward here. Quote, "The theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property." Close quote, Karl Marx. From the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice how all three are under assault today. And keep in mind that pursuit of happiness, the founders always understood to include largely the right to own private property, to exchange private property, and to hold private property. First, a disclaimer before I get into the heart of this. What you're about to hear are my own opinions. I'm not endorsed by anyone. They wouldn't be quite that foolish necessarily. And not endorsed by any organization. So I'm here speaking for myself, and I should be held accountable as an individual. Secondly, I'm here by invitation because I wrote a book. In and of itself, it's not that noteworthy unless it turns out to be useful in some way. If you want one, there is a flyer back here. You can Google the title. It's easy to get on Amazon or Tate Publishing, the publishing house, or Barnes & Noble carries it. The ebook version is the cheapest way to go, by the way. It's entitled The Cross and the Constitution in the Age of Incoherence, and I wrote it over a period of about 10 years. It's a collection of essays and columns, and I really did try to provide reasonable analysis of reliable information. Also, I'd like to just say, for anyone here who may not be a Christian, I am a Christian, and by that I mean that I have accepted God's gift of salvation by grace through faith in the finished work of the cross. I am a born-again believer, redeemed by the blood of Christ, and I would invite you to consider His claim on your life. I bring nothing to the table. I am forgiven because He died in my place, and I repented. I have salvation thanks to His righteousness alone. My life verse is Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And my favorite verse in the scripture comes from 1 Corinthians 8:2. If any man thinks he knows something, he knows nothing as he ought to know it. It's a great leveler. And it reminds me constantly that I might think I know something, but I better double check with the Lord all the time. Therefore, ultimately, the only thing of real value is the gospel of Christ, the one who delivers us from sin, death, and hell. And a few personal notes, if I may. Jody and I have been married almost 22 years. We have 4 kids. Our oldest son, Sean, is serving with the United States Marine Corps. Daughter Eva is brilliant and beautiful and attending high school. Luke, who's here with us today, 14, Civil Air Patrol, cadet, just designated Cadet of the Month up in Butte County where we live. Well done. And Alana is in 1st grade, and her nickname is Delightful. And I ask her, what's your nickname, every night before tucking her in? She says, most often she says Delightful. She has some other creative responses too. I grew up just down the road about a mile. My folks provided us with a wonderful, idyllic childhood. We rode horses a lot, even to school now and again, and I attended the Little Red Schoolhouse right over here for 4 years. Got my first of many black eyes over there. Kissed Becky on the cheek and set the record for timeouts. Sitting beneath the sobering gaze of Washington and Lincoln, their pictures bookending the flag. At the little white church over there in town, I attended Sunday school. and sang in the kids' choir. It's now a mortuary, and I guess we'll all be attending there one of these days. I'd like to begin by telling you a story about a man named Frank Lay. I met Frank while working at Liberty Council in Florida last year. Frank is retired now. He served for more than 30 years as a teacher and then as principal at Pace High School near Pensacola. That region of the country is the buckle of the Bible Belt. For generations, folks have been greeting each other with God bless you and praise the Lord. As a matter of course. There's a whole lot of Johnny Rebs down in that neck of the woods, and they know something about states' rights. I worked for months with a bunch of pastors down there, and I got to tell you, I love those guys. They're just so on fire for the Lord, and they love this country, and they're so concerned about what's going on. Anyway, one day years ago, a student at Pace High School complained to Frank about all the God talk at school, claiming it was a violation of church and state. Frank, being the gentleman he is, tried explaining that it was their culture, that folks around there just love God and each other, and they encourage each other, no harm or disrespect intended to unbelievers. Well, that wasn't good enough for this student. She recruited others and the ACLU to press the issue. A team of ACLU lawyers were deployed. They threatened the school board with a lawsuit, and of course the school board surrendered and allowed the ACLU to draft a consent decree laying down the law with penalties, which was eventually, by the way, reinforced by the federal court. Pretty soon it was a violation to have a Bible sitting on your desk, a violation to say God bless you if somebody sneezed, a violation to talk about spiritual matters, a violation to pray or pretend to pray at any public gathering. God talk was prohibited. Well, Frank tried to warn the board about the ACLU, tried to get them to seek other counsel, but it was a foregone conclusion. Some of the board members were Christians, yet they submitted to the pressure to relinquish their First Amendment rights. Shortly after the installment of the consent decree, Frank was off campus with a small group of parents who had donated money to build a new field house. He was hosting a thank you luncheon for this group, and as a matter of custom, he asked the athletic director to say grace. Well, guess what happened? Sure enough, they were reported, and Frank and the athletic director were hauled into federal court charged with criminal contempt. They faced these penalties if convicted: dismissal, loss of retirement benefits, jail time, and a $5,000 fine. For a 10-second prayer to bless the food off campus, no students present, all adults consenting. Liberty Council stepped in, and after several years and $400,000 in legal expenses, the men were found not guilty, but a precedent was set, thankfully, rolling back to the consent decree. However, lifelong friendships were destroyed as people took conflicting sides in the struggle. Afterward, at a settlement hearing, Frank reports he told the ACLU attorney, and by the way, there were 8 of them at one time against one Liberty Council attorney who used to say, "This isn't fair. There's 8 over there and 1 here. It's not fair to them. I've got God on my side." That attorney is Harry Mahet, by the way. I'm just going to take a little break because I'm going to tell you the story about Harry. Harry's from Romania. Harry's folks were pastors in Romania. Harry grew up in the underground church in Romania where the door could get kicked in at 3 in the morning. The secret police looking for Bibles that they used to hide under the table. German shepherds going through your house at 3 in the morning. And Harry Mahet came to this country. He heard about the land of the free, Libertate in Romania. And he came to the land of the free and went to law school and is now fighting on our behalf to preserve our rights and our freedoms because he knows what can happen. He grew up in it. And he knows how It's not fair to ACLU attorneys. Anyway, Frank reports at the settlement hearing that he talked to the ACLU attorney in attendance that day and said he was glad that freedom of speech, freedom of religion had won the day. And the ACLU attorneys turned to him and sneered and said, yeah, but we changed your culture, didn't we? Keep that in mind as we proceed. And keep the idea of cultural revolution in mind, too. As a footnote to Frank's story, Roger Baldwin was the founder of the ACLU, and he died in 1981. Listen to this quote from Roger Baldwin explaining his belief and his reason for launching the ACLU. Quote, "I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately for abolishing the state itself. I seek the social ownership of property, the abolition of the propertied class, and the sole control of those who produce wealth. Communism is the goal." The only way that you can control property is through the government. Complete government control is their goal, always has been for at least 100 years. Now these people traffic, the ACLU and others, they traffic in fear and intimidation and lies. We've heard, oh, by the way, what does that sound like? The father of lies. We've heard for years about assaults on Christians, most often targeted by the ACLU for their faith and persecuted for their beliefs. The photographer in New Mexico fined $6,000 by a human rights commission for respectfully declining to photograph a homosexual wedding. The pastor arrested for sharing the gospel at a shopping center. The youth pastor detained and questioned for simply answering a question about the gospel. Christians arrested for handing out literature at a Muslim rally. Pastors arrested and fined for having Bible studies in their homes. Christians arrested and jailed for stating their views at a homosexual pride parade. A lot of this is detailed in my book. Zoning laws arbitrarily changed to prevent the building of churches. Pastors threatened and arrested for preaching about the sin of homosexuality. When government sinfully lurches out of control, funding groups like the ACLU, we have a responsibility to respond. Take this into consideration. The one Christ called the greatest who ever lived, John the Baptist, was not bashful about speaking up. He called the religious leaders hypocrites, vipers. He confronted the king for his sin and was beheaded. Leadership matters. A Christian presence in the culture matters, especially as the war on Christianity escalates. Speaking of leadership, how many of you remember during his presidency, Mr. Reagan landed in that field on Marine One to attend Sunday services in the old sanctuary? An AP story, March 30th, 1986, reported, quote, "President Reagan marked the 5th anniversary of the 1981 attempt on his life by attending Easter services Sunday in a small Presbyterian church a few miles from his mountaintop ranch." And by the way, ask Dad about this. He and a group of guys who were from the valley were partially responsible for encouraging Mr. Reagan to run for governor. Ask him about that story. It's a great story. But speaking of Mr. Reagan, I'd like to remind you of one of his famous quotes. "If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, we'll be one nation gone under." There will be very troubling days ahead. Many say collapse and chaos are right around the corner. Numerous spirit-filled people say many of us sitting here today will see the second coming. Think of that. Many of us sitting right here, right now, will see him coming in the clouds as he ascended before. So we should never lose hope and always